Good morning, everyone. So we're gonna start already because we only have 30 minutes and people are still joining, but it's introduction first, so it's not a big deal if they miss that part. So thank you for joining us today. Quickly, let me present myself. I'm Stefan Hof. I'm Business Development Manager at Exclusive Networks. I'm responsible for the emerging vendors like Axonius. And with me today, we have our pre-sales Cedric.
Hi everyone, my name is Cedric de pre-sales engineer here at Exclusive for about 6 months now. Yeah, I'm happy to be here to talk about Axonius.
All right, so we have 30 minutes. It's going to be like a 50-50 split between 50 minutes about talking about NIS2 and how we can do it, especially for Belgium, adapt through the NIST framework, and how Axonius can help you with those controls on the NIST framework. So that's the flow we're going to follow today. We're not alone today. We also have support from Axonius for the Q&A later on. But like I mentioned before, we have a limited amount of time. And to be fair, if I knew that it would be this much information, I would have taken a longer time to present it. But today is a brief information session about NIS, about Axonius, and we're going to do a more deep dive session anyway later on about NIS2 and with a really expert for that session. So okay, let's begin. So NIS2 Directive, what to expect? Well, first, what is NIS2? It's a successor of NIS1, of course. NIS1 was first there in 2016 and was about network and information security. It was Europe legislation or European directive, and then later on in the Belgian legislation. It's about security and a lot of measurements we're going to take, but NIS2 goes a lot further than that. We're going to address more sectors and a lot more entities. You know, NIS1 was for like 100 entities. With NIS2, the estimation is more than 2,000 entities need to be compliant. There's also new selection and registration process. Before it was an active process and selection, where you as a company were contacted that you were have to be compliant with NIS1. In this case, you're going to register yourself. There's a new way how to deal with incidents and policies around that. A lot of extra security requirements, and the deadline for all member states, because it's now an European directive, but it needs to be in the Belgian legislation, and the deadline for that is October 24. So all member states in Europe have a way to adapt their own way of this legislation into their own local law. So first quick recap was NIS1 again. Directive from 2016, but in the Belgian legislation since 2019. So you see, it takes some time for a directive to become a legislation in a member state. In the beginning, it was really focused for the identification of those operating substantial services. Those were the most critical sectors and entities that need to be better protected, and there need to be some rules about governance and compliance. There were 7 key sectors involved, and we will see them, but we're just going to go wider. So those 7 key sectors are still in scope, but the scope now gets bigger and bigger. In the beginning, there was also a focus on the EU cooperation, and they will just keep on doing that. So a lot of cooperation between member states, but also between companies in those member states to share knowledge, to share intelligence, cyber intelligence, and best practices. There was minimum security measures. That minimum is coming up, so there are going to be new rules about that. And there was like the first ground rules of if there's an incident, what do we expect of reporting? And it also becomes very clear in NIS2 how much time you have and what information you have to disclose if there's an incident. So the sectors that NIS covered was before, it was especially like healthcare, energy, digital service providers. That stays the same. All those will be in scope, but now it will be also added an extra amount of different sectors. So all these sectors are also now in scope for NIS2. So that means that, like I mentioned before, we come from 100 entities now over 2,000 entities. If you're in scope, and there's the whole explanation when you're in scope, and if you then either be critical, essential, or important, there are different rules about that. But if you're in scope, what's the impact for you as an organization or as a person even? Well, it will be a passive selection. And before it was the ministry, and they get their advice from Cybersecurity Center and stuff like that about, okay, who is very important, who we do need to protect. Now you have to register yourself. It's like Save on Web, so for your taxes, but then for Save on Web online, for companies to do that registration. So it's a portal you can register yourself. By March 2025, all member states must have the list of every company that's impacted by NIS2 Directive. But it can also have an impact on you as a management, so management responsibility. We'll go deeper into that later on. Risk management, security measures, very important also for a company to do that. And the way of incident reporting, but also, and this is quite new, the supervision and the possible sanction. If you're not compliant, if you didn't do your work, the sanctioning can be quite severe. So the passive selection, I hope you can read it at home. You will get the slides afterwards with all the sources, so you can look it up yourself. But depending on which sector you are, or even a subsector, you could be either essential, critical, important, or just not in scope. But this is, again, this is from the European Union, this is a directive. Even a member state can still say, okay, even for small companies, we are going to bring you in scope as either essential or important. So there's difference between, okay, what sector am I in, and then even the subsector, and then, okay, how large is my entity? Am I above or below 250 employees, or is my annual turnover above or below 50 million? So based on those parameters, you're going to be either essential or important. And what's an impact for management? Management will have to approve all risk management measures. So they need to have a look at it, they need to understand it, they need to be guided, and they need to approve it. And not only approve it, but then also see the results of it. So they have to oversee all the cybersecurity measures that has been implemented. And that's a real challenge, because approving something on paper is one thing, but actually making sure that it's being carried out, that's very difficult. Okay, you can have certain entities that can test your organization, or they can see the status of your of the deployment and is policies being followed. But how can you do that continuously, and how can you make that even profitable for you as an organization, to make sure you don't get bankrupt with all the testing that needs to be done. And there can be personal liability if there's non-compliant. So if you get breached and you're compliant, that's not an issue. But if you get breached and you are non-compliant because you didn't do what you actually should have done, then you can be personally responsible for that. There's also a lot of focus on training and awareness. So they need to offer proper training for all people in the organization. And it's also lead by example, so they need to follow the training themselves. So that's a big responsibility for management now. They cannot just say, okay, the CISO is responsible or the team manager is responsible. No, it's really group effort. Everybody needs to pitch in this one. I mentioned about the security measures and the governance, that awareness and training is an important part, but also taking the necessary technical security measures. There is a very good documentation about what the CCP actually expects from different companies, depending on which category of critical or important, what they need to do. So it's very good mapped out, and stuff like asset management, but also cybersecurity policies in place, pen testing, all that type of stuff is very well indicated in what companies need to invest and make sure that it's being done. And it's also mapped very good on multiple frameworks. Today we're going to talk about NIST, because it's a very good start to go through. If you use NIST as a basic foundation, but you can also use CISO or ISO, whatever actually, because they really help you in mapping all those different steps you need to take as an organization with those frameworks. But of course, we're going to look at the size of a company and how, based on the category, how critical it is to make sure you do the proportional requirements, but also the assurance that it's been doing, that's been done well. Risk management is getting more and more important. So what they expect that they do an annual cyber supply chain risk assessment. or if there's a big change. Of course, if there's a new computer in the organization, that won't be a big change. But if you change from an NIST provider, for example, or a total new system of ERP, CRM, whatever, that's a big impact on the organization, and then you need to do that assessment. Not only that, but cybersecurity roles have to be well defined. Okay, who's responsible for what and what is their authority? So clear rules on paper to see who's responsible. If there's an incident, everything needs to be very good mapped out. About information security and cybersecurity risks, everything should be documented, and that needs to be approved by your management. So don't leave anything to confidence. Everything needs to be well addressed. Good documentation is key here, that everybody knows what to do if there's an incident. We're going to share more and more best practices, but also threat intelligence. So if you're in a certain sector that's been under attack, then the goal is that you know what are the ways that they're getting attacked, that you share those information between different companies to make sure you're well adjusted and well protected in that case. And risk management, everything starts with asset management. So know your assets, know the vulnerabilities, they're identified and documented, that you know, okay, this is an asset or a server, this is the goal of that server, that everybody knows that what is running and why it's running in an environment. For incident reporting, it's like with GDPR. If it's a major incident, you need to address that, but also you need to make sure that you say that to the authorities. So it will be the same as the registration part. You will have to do that in an online portal. If there's a significant impact on your services, you need to make an incident notice of that. The first 24 hours it will be very brief because you don't have all the information yet. After 72 hours, you'll have some idea about the impact, but hopefully also, okay, what is my indicator of compromise here? So I can share that with authorities. And then after a month, they expect a full report with all details about the incident reports. Supervision and sanctioning. If you're an essential entity, you need to do a lot of investments even before there's an incident. So they expect from you, even before an incident, that you do have that inspections, those target security audits, but also regular audits. And not just if there's an incident, but also every quarter or every half year, depending on the registration, you have to do those audits. But also you need to make sure that wherever it's been decided, is it implemented, and what's the status of that implementation. So you need to provide evidence, and on request they can ask you for your policies, and you need to be sure that everything's in place. A fine is also possible, so quite large, 10 million euro or 2% of your annual turnover of your company. Those fines are not because you're breached, that's if you're not compliant, because you didn't do the necessary investments or policies enforcement that was actually necessary. For important entities, it's only after an incident that they will ask for the extra information. So the CCB says, okay, if you're a company and you're now in NIS2, how do you start? Where do you begin? Well, they actually made very good documentation about it. The starting point is NIST. Why? Because if you look at the 5 functions of NIST, it's identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And they actually base their documentations on a lot of those controls of NIST. Sorry, NIST with a T. And we will share the slides afterwards, and then you can see the sources we used, and they have very good documentation about every step of the way as an organization. Where do you need the investment? How do you do that? And guidance lines and everything. So if we can use NIST as a good guideline, then that's very good for us, because Axonius can already do a lot of controls with NIST. Okay, so with cybersecurity, cyber fundamental frameworks, they say, if you're a small organization, we will start with 25 questions. This is non-technical, but then you can write it down, and with answering those questions, you will get your security at a more mature level. And it goes up every time. It tops with more controls. and eventually those controls will be easily checked with different frameworks. And there's some very specific for NIST controls also. So this is all very well documented. And for example, about identify, the first one of NIST, but this is an example from the documentation of the CCP, that physical devices and systems used within organizations are inventoried. And there's more explanation in a way you can comprehend it actually, and also a guidance with how you do that. And look at the last sentence in the guidance. The use of an IT asset management tool could be considered, especially for larger organizations. It should be considered. Another one, for example, is about protection. Your data address is protected. Doesn't matter where we store our data, it needs to be protected, so it needs to be encrypted. If it's on-prem or cloud asset in a cloud bucket, whatever, it needs to be encrypted. So those are all different controls that the CCP is saying, okay, as an organization, you need to check that you're complying with these type of controls. So how can Axonius help? Well, Axonius is a cybersecurity asset management tool. It can also help you with SaaS management, with all your cloud assets. So for compliancy, building checks for compliancy with your cloud assets. They can even do policy enforcement to make sure that, okay, we want to have everything encrypted. If that's not the case, then I want to make a ticket. I want to send an automatic email. I want to tag a device, whatever. It's an API integration. We can do a lot with that enforcement. It can also help you with vulnerability and incident management. So all these use cases are very helpful in getting you more compliant. If you look at the controls, again, we mentioned that. The good thing is, with Axonius, we have a large coverage already based on NIST. So for 61 controls, we can have full coverage, and for 57, we have partial, meaning we can provide you some very good information, but you need to do some other checks before you can say, okay, check the box. The Axonius controls coverage per family, this is more in detail where we can help you with, so you get a good idea, okay, these are the controls where Axonius can really make our lives easier, where we have very fast indication and very good visibility. All right, and next is my colleague, Cedric.
So yeah, I would like to continue on what Stan mentioned in the previous slide. Here we can see an overview of the 20 security family controls that are defined in the NIST framework. Unfortunately, we will not have enough time to cover them all, but we would like to show you some examples of fully implemented security controls that Axonius can provide your organization. First, we will try to understand how Axonius can create that list, that always up-to-date asset inventory list, unifying all your assets, including cloud assets and unmanaged devices. And next, we will show you how Axonius can provide you comprehensive visibility into help you control complex IT environments, but also show you what kind of actions you can take using the Axonius Enforcement Center. So let's dive into the demo. First, I would like to show you how Axonius can gather information about your assets. So Axonius does not require you to add some new agents into your environment. Axonius will not scan your network for assets. Instead, Axonius uses adapters. And an adapter establishes an API connection to your existing business, IT, and or security management tools to accurately collect your data of all your assets. So here we can see that we have a lot of, or a couple of adapters in this demo tenant. One of the adapters is an antivirus called McAfee. And we can see that McAfee has detected about 34,000 devices in our organization. However, if we take a look at the other adapters, they also have discovered some devices, but less. And we can see that each adapter has discovered a different amount of devices in our organization. Axonius will gather all this information together. It will remove duplicate devices. It will normalize the data and finally correlate all this information about your devices to give you one number, one total unique devices being seen in your organization. So in this demo tenants, we can see that we have about 40,327 devices being detected in this environment. And why is this important, and what can we do based on that information? Well, as I mentioned, different adapters, they are all identifying different devices. And what we could do is take a look at, for instance, how many of my devices are protected by my antivirus, or how many of my devices are protected by a VA tool, such as Tenable. And in this diagram here, we can see that about 71% of the devices are considered compliant. Why is that? Because they all have an antivirus as well as Tenable installed. However, we can see that about 50% of the devices are missing Tenable. We can also see that about 3% of the devices is missing the antivirus, and we can also see the intersection, meaning that 40, in this case 12% of the devices are missing both the antivirus as well as the Tenable agent. So those widgets, those dashboards will give you a quick indication of how good or how bad my assets are compliant. I talked about the unique total devices that Axonius can detect in your organization. If I go to the device tab, I can have access to this asset inventory, so all the assets that are in my organization. I can have a look at some detailed information about the asset, as well as how many of those adapters have been able to gather information about that device. So if we take a look at an example here, the first device in our organization, we can see that different amounts of adapters have been gathered information about this asset. For instance, McAfee is discovering information about the operating system as well as the hard drives, but maybe we also have some directory services in place so we can get information about the users, user groups, etc. But a much powerful tool here is the aggregated tab. In the aggregated tab, you will be able to see all the information gathered from the different sources. And they will be segmented into a couple of tabs. So we have a tab about basic information. This will regroup information about the endpoint, the operating system, the hard drives, even network interfaces, etc. But we can also take a look at what kind of software is installed on this particular asset. So here we can see the software that is installed as well as the software version. And this is kind of important when you think about identifying vulnerabilities for that particular software. So here on this asset, you can see that we have about 270 vulnerabilities that have been identified. However, if you're interested in vulnerabilities, I highly recommend you to use the vulnerabilities tab. So here in this example, I have created a query to filter out the vulnerabilities based on the severity. So only high, critical, and urgent vulnerabilities are shown on the screen. Not only you can have access to the vulnerability ID, and if you do click here on this vulnerability ID, you will be redirected to the NIST website and have much more information about this vulnerability. Another nice thing that you can see on this page is the device count. So how many of my devices are vulnerable to this particular vulnerability? And if I do click on this device count, I will be redirected to my asset inventory list, where this time I have a query being created that is searching for all assets that are vulnerable to this particular vulnerability. So now that we have identified all the assets that are vulnerable to those vulnerabilities, we may want to take action. So the first thing we could do is create a tag or add some information to the device itself, but maybe we want something more to help us automate actions to reduce manual and repetitive tasks. So then we could use the Axonius Enforcement Center. A couple of examples of actions you can take with Axonius is notify or alert your teams. So you can create an email or send an email with some information to your administrators or to the users. You could also use Slack or team messages to notify and create alerts. And as I mentioned before, you can also integrate with some existing ticketing system or incident and response. So maybe you are using Jira or ServiceNow. And last but not least, maybe you have some other tools such as a VA tool. So I showed you in this demo, we have a Tenable in place. So maybe you are interested in adding some information about the device or the IP address to this VA tool. Hopefully, or in most of the cases, you are using Active Directory or directory services, so you can also integrate with those to create, disable, or modify user accounts and user groups. The last thing I would like to show you here in the Axonius platforms are the dashboards. So if we go back to the home page, we created some dashboards about the assets. So this gives you a nice overview of what kind of assets you do have in your organization. So we can see we have a couple of Windows servers, but also Windows workstations, as well as some Linux devices. And as we mentioned previously, Axonius is also able to identify your assets in clouds. So here you can see that we do have about 7,000 Linux devices that are hosted in the Azure cloud. Depending on your use cases, your controls you want to implement, you can create those dashboards, those queries to give you this nice overview. Another example here are the agent coverage. So maybe you are interested in how many agents are being installed. So here we can see an example for McAfee. You can see that about 100 of Windows devices are still missing McAfee. The same for the other. Again, as I mentioned, based on your requirements, you can create some other dashboards as well about vulnerabilities or some security issues. So maybe you are interested in having some view about how many of those agents are maybe broken or not working correctly. So again, those dashboards will give you a quick and nice overview about what's going on in your organization. As I mentioned previously, this is a demo environment, so the dashboards I can show you are kind of limited. So we added a couple of extra slides. So I will not have enough time to cover them all in detail, but I think this gives a nice overview of how you can use the Axonius dashboards. So for instance, to have a look at your EDR deployments and having information regarding the agents and the agent versions of this EDR. So here we can see that Sentinel-1 has been deployed on most of the Windows devices, but still we are missing 2 devices that are not installed with Sentinel-1. However, we can see that the macOS devices in our case here are completely fine. They are all installed with Sentinel-1. As I mentioned, maybe you are interested in some other information regarding the agent versions. So here we can see that today we are running version 22, but we still have some devices that are running a really older version 1.42. Again, based on your needs, we can create some more dashboards, some more queries. Here we have an example about vulnerabilities. This is a quite nice dashboard here because for security teams, we can see that this particular date we started patching, so we can see the effect, if it is positive or negative, on those vulnerabilities. And on the right side, we can have a nice overview of the different vulnerabilities that have been identified in our organization based on the severity. Maybe you are interested in having some information about what kind of tools are used for remote access. This slide shows you an overview of 4 tools that have been deployed across different countries. And again, those kind of dashboards can be really helpful when you try or when you are doing a migration and you want to understand, okay, how many of those agents I still need to migrate. Stan mentioned it before, it is also important to be able to protect your data. So maybe you require some data at rest encryption. Here we have an example of cloud assets that are being analyzed to see if the buckets or if the hard drive is correctly encrypted or not. Of course, we can do the same for on-premise devices such as a workstation to try to identify if the disk is completely encrypted or not. And if you have a unified endpoint management solution in place, you will also be able to identify more information about your mobile devices. So in this example, we can see all the devices that are protected with data at rest encryption. And last but not least, I told you to reduce manual and repetitive tasks. You can use the Axonius Enforcement Center to help you take actions and automate those actions. So we saw a couple of examples where you can notify and alert your teams, create some tickets, or update the VA tool.
All right, thank you, Cedric. Our goal here today was to show you that Axonius can really help you in the whole guidance to NIS2 compliancy. For management purpose, you can have quickly an idea about, okay, what's our status, how well is our deployment coming, our policies being enforced or not. It's something from a single pane, you will have that visibility. For the teams, it's for technical teams, it's very good to have that single pane of glass to show you the single point of truth about, okay, we are performing very good. We have, for example, our critical vulnerabilities, and in time we showed that we can patch them within 24 hours. It's stuff like this that we can build reports that are very good for audits, but also very good internally to keep your organization on track. If you have questions, because we're already out of time, please put them in the Q&A. We will try to answer them, and otherwise we will get that later on through email or telephone call. Okay, so we got a question from Peter. Any way to get visualization on how devices endpoints are connected? So more a network overview based on correlated devices?
Yes, of course. We could provide you some examples or some more detailed examples. I won't be able to show you that here in the demo environment. Again, we are limited with the data. But if you are interested, do not hesitate to send us a little email, or I will note down your question, and so you'll be able to provide you some examples of those dashboards.
All right, that's answered. Then we got a very deep dive question from Leo. Leo, we're going to take this offline because your questions are actually 3 or 4 different questions, and some stuff I need to check, to be honest. It's about pen testing and compliancy with pen testing for NIS2. So I will get back to you later on for that one. So, okay, if there are not any more questions, our next webinar will be, for Axonius, will be about EDR coverage, for example, but really agent coverage, because we just touched that in this webinar. We're going to do a more deep dive about how you can get the right information, the right results to really see how well is your coverage and implementation of your tools doing. So the idea is stop buying new tools, except Axonius then, but really get the most out of the current tools you're having to make sure you are actually deploying like you should be, and that your coverage is near to 100% at least. Okay, so thank you for joining us today, and have a nice day.